Welcome to Talkless Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Butler, and I'm your host for Talkless Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org. In addition, I'm the editor-in-chief of Texas Plus Water and the Texas Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guest today is Dr. Megan Lang. Dr. Lang is Chief Scientist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wetlands Inventory Program and leads the congressionally mandated National Wetland Status and Trend Study. She is also an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland and serves as an associate editor for the journal Wetlands. Megan has been working to improve the assessment of aquatic ecosystems through field and remote sensing studies for over 2 decades. Megan, welcome, and thank you for being part of Talkless Water.
Thank you, Todd. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about wetlands, a subject that's really near and dear to my heart.
Well, it's near and dear to my heart, too, and I was really excited when you were willing to come on and talk about wetlands. So let's start out with your background in water. When did you first start thinking about a career related to water or to wetlands?
That's a really good question, but I don't think that I can point to a specific moment. Growing up with a father who was in the Navy, I was really always near water, always near the coast. When I was young, I spent much of my time walking through small creeks, looking at minnows and water striders as I slowly made my way downstream towards larger streams and lakes. As I got older, I noticed how wildlife gravitated towards water, especially wetlands. For that reason and others, I love spending time near wetlands, all sorts of wetlands, from cypress swamps to salt marshes. Going to college in Charleston, South Carolina, I began to more fully appreciate the profound influence that wetlands and water have on our lives. And to me, when I looked around, the signs of the importance of water were just everywhere. From the seafood we ate to flooded roads to water birds flying overhead, water was really central to life in Charleston, and we called that area the Low Country. Thus, water, through time, especially wetlands, just became part of who I am and therefore what I wanted to focus on in a career. Not just because of my interest in wetlands, and I do find wetlands fascinating, but because I wanted to help conserve wetlands and their benefits.
Well, it's interesting, but, so most of my guests, really have an experience like that growing up. And I certainly did. My father would take my brother and I hunting and fishing, and we'd be in wetlands, and I was like, really kind of, fascinated with how, we're in this marsh in Louisiana. Boy, it's so different than this flooded timber area. We were in Texas and we're on this river fishing. And, those childhood experiences seem to be, a real commonality for people who enter, fields like you're in and I'm in. And so, just a real important thing that, part of parenting, I guess, that, if you're able to get your kids outdoors, it's so beneficial to them in the long run. So you are the lead author of Status and Trends of Wetlands in the Coterminous United States, 2009 to 2019. And so, I want to talk about that study because when I was starting out in my career, I worked in D.C. And had an internship and then a graduate researchship, and they were both focused on wetlands. And I was very familiar with that study, which was around then, one of the previous editions. And I was reading it all the time, and it's like, this is so fascinating, and it was so important to the work that I'm doing. And so when I saw that the new one was out, I was like, we really have to, talk to the lead author about it and what's in it. But let's just kind of start out for, my listeners who are not really familiar with the benefits of wetlands. What value would you say they provide to, Americans and, anybody in this country?
Yeah, so although folks might expect this to be a really easy question to answer, because wetlands provide so many benefits, to me it's hard because I really don't even know where to start, but I will give it a try. So wetlands have long provided food and building materials, as well as recreational opportunities for communities like hunting, fishing, kayaking, and bird watching. There's really something for everyone. And these recreational opportunities, they actually benefit the health and the well-being of tens of millions of Americans each year. So that's important in and of itself. Additionally, wetlands have long been an important cultural resource for communities, including Native American tribes. For thousands of years, wetlands have been valued by Native societies, in large part because they provide what we all need to live, from materials to build homes, to clean water, to important sources of medicine and food like wild rice. Wetlands are especially valued today because they help to avoid or mitigate many of our most pressing environmental challenges, including increasing temperatures, rising sea levels, hurricanes and other severe storms, droughts, floods, and wildfires, as well as the growing need for readily available clean water. Studies have shown that the value provided by wetlands to people is unmatched by any other habitat beyond coral reefs. And we estimate that wetland ecosystem services related just to commercial fishing, water quality and supply, recreation, and flood control provide over $7.7 trillion in benefits annually to people just within the lower 48 states. Wetlands also support a wide range of plant and animal species, many of which are rare or have a commercial or recreational value. Although wetlands are only found in a tiny portion of the lower 48 states, less than 6% by area, about 50% of our nation's threatened and endangered species are wetland dependent. These include species like the American crocodile, Chinook salmon, whooping crane, and manatee. Similarly, about 80% of protected birds depend on wetlands. And wetlands are also critical to fisheries, which feed our families and support our economy. Finally, wetlands provide stopover and wintering habitats for more than 4 billion birds from Canada, as well as breeding habitats for nearly 5 billion migratory birds en route to the tropics. So again, they just provide so many benefits. I'm sure that I did not cover them all.
You know, when I hear all the things that wetlands are doing for us that we don't really think about or take for granted, you know, it's almost, if you go back to when you're learning math in middle school, Venn diagram, you know, when you have all the environmental problems we're trying to manage, and the Venn diagrams for all those, they all seem to include wetlands in one way or the other, whether it has to do with climate change or biodiversity, endangered species, or water quality, or, you know, flood mitigation, or, you know, recharge of aquifers, or you know, fisheries. I mean, it's just so it's you know, it's so I don't know what the term is, so all reaching and you know, kind of, you know, comprehensive in some ways, that it's really, you know, pretty startling to think that, you know, we're still losing them at such a significant clip, which we'll get into that in a minute. But you know, so go ahead and, you know, tell us about these reports. You know, why is the Fish and Wildlife Service producing these wetland status and trend reports?
Sure. So the service is required by Congress to produce decadal reports on the status and trends of our nation's wetlands. And we've been doing that since the early 1980s. These reports provide impartial scientific estimates of the extent of wetland and deepwater habitats within the lower 48 states, as well as their change over time. Our recently published report, which covers the years 2009 through 2019, is actually the sixth in a series of congressionally mandated reports spanning nearly 70 years. Each report builds on the previous one, providing an invaluable historical perspective and increasing our understanding of landscape patterns and processes. However, it's important to point out that our reports do not set policy. Instead, the information in our reports are used by natural resource managers and policymakers to make strategic decisions regarding wetland management. The reports are used to guide the funding, planning, and implementation of wetland restoration and enhancement, habitat assessments, strategic habitat conservation, and ecosystem management activities. They've also been used to support the strategic and efficient implementation of national policies and to gauge the success of policies like the no net loss of wetlands goal.
So I remember the first one of these reports that I read, and this is probably 86 or 87, was, I guess author or the lead author was somebody named Kawarden, I think, and I never forgot that name because I've read that report so many times, and so I was, very interested in, the fact that it's a series, and I'm curious when was the first one published?
First one was published in the early 80s. I don't remember if it's 82 or 83, but again, we've been producing those reports for quite a long time. And even though the first report came out in the early 80s, we started our coverage of examining wetland area and trends back at the 1950s in terms of using aerial photography, and then we moved on to satellite imagery. But we also have, another report that scrapes together all the information that we could to get at wetland change between the 1780s and the 1980s. So we do have this series of national reports, and then we have the retrospective report, and then we have a whole bunch of regional reports.
So I think that first report was the one that I read, and I've still got it on my bookshelf over here. It's in here someplace. So it's kind of a collector's item at this point. So let's talk about some of the basics here. Do we have a pretty good idea of maybe how many wetlands there were, say, prior to 1700 and maybe, in comparison to what we have today? Do we have a sense of, the kind of roughly the number of millions of acres in wetlands and what percentage we've got left now?
Yeah, sure. So in the 1700s, we didn't have the modern technology that we use today to map wetlands. That said, we certainly had hand-drawn maps and written estimates of wetland area. And based on this information, we estimate that in the 1780s, we had over 221 million acres of wetlands in what now constitutes the lower 48 states. And more information, like if you want to know exactly how we came up with these numbers, and if you want to get more details, those can be found in a report by Tom Dahl. And the report came out in 1990. And the report tells us between 1780s and 1980s, we lost 53% of wetlands within the lower 48 states. So when personally, I hear all the time, we've already lost over half of our wetlands. Well, that information comes from this report, and that information is oftentimes used as a reason why we need to enhance conservation or implement more conservation, or the reason why our remaining wetlands are so important. So that report really, even though it's kind of small in its stature, I mean, it's not a very long report. It's had a huge estimate. And if you dig deeper into that report, you can find that California is estimated to have lost the largest percent of its wetlands at 91%. And Florida is estimated to have lost the largest area of wetlands at 9.3 million acres over the 200-year study period. Texas, since we're talking about Texas, is estimated to have lost 52% of its wetlands between the 1780s and 1980s.
Gotcha. You mentioned California and the, I guess, 91% or so of wetlands that was lost there. I saw an old map of California from I think it was the early 1800s, and it showed the Central Valley almost as a lake. I mean, that was one giant wetland. And, that some of the people were thinking about, well, you've got to cross this lake and then you get to California, which is this mountain chain along the coast. And so, I'm guessing that's where most of the wetlands in California that were lost were located. It was in the Central Valley.
In the Central Valley and along the coast, so in a few different areas. California didn't start out with a lot of wetlands, so they didn't have a lot to lose, and unfortunately, they lost over 91%.
So when you look back over the 300 years or so, and we think about all the wetlands that have been lost, what are the primary factors that you find were responsible for, land that was a wetland becoming something else eventually?
Yes, I believe that the fundamental reason that we've lost so many wetlands since European settlement is that in the past, most Americans didn't understand the importance of wetlands. So in colonial America, really on up to the mid-1900s, wetlands were widely regarded to be wastelands that should be drained, filled, and otherwise converted to what was considered to be productive land use. And these benefits led to the widespread drainage and fill of wetlands over hundreds of years. Through time, Americans began to experience the negative effects of this wetland loss, like worsening water quality, increased flooding, and declining food supply. And gradually, we began to understand the value of wetlands and develop far-reaching policies supporting wetland conservation. Unfortunately, most wetlands in the lower 48 states had already been lost by that point. We're now trying to figure out how to contend with the effects of wetland loss and the growing need for the wetlands, benefits, all the benefits that wetlands provide. They're oftentimes called ecosystem services. And those services are especially needed as populations grow and climate and land cover changes.
Just thinking about what you're saying there, one of the things that's always kind of, stood out to me, maybe in more recent decades, is that, people, I think, do have a sense that wetlands are valuable in one way or the other. But, they, I guess, maybe also will sometimes come to a conclusion that, well, those benefits are really distributed to other people and I don't really benefit from them as much. And then maybe, that's one of the things that underlies or justifies a decision to convert a wetland to something else, that, they're not able to really capture the benefits as much themselves. And so the value, really might not be one that they appreciate, I guess, is one way to think about it, because it's not something that, helps them put food on the table or does something like that, which, is a real challenge when you're thinking about ways to encourage people, to preserve their wetlands, given that the benefits from wetlands are shared by a lot of other folks.
Absolutely. I think that, in some realms that's called the tragedy of the commons, right? Where
Right.
the, resources that are commonly shared, aren't necessarily valued quite as much as the resources that belong to individuals. But we're going to need to think even more about communities, if in the needs of communities, for the benefits that are provided by wetlands and other natural resources, if we want to conserve the benefits of wetlands for future generations, right? And those are our children, and we are all responsible for the lives that those children live, right? The decisions we make today will have ramifications tomorrow.
Right, right. So let's come back to your report, the new report, Status and Trends of Wetlands in the Coterminous United States, 2009 to 2019. So what's changed during the period you examined, 2009 to 2019, compared to the period covered in the report that was published prior to this one?
Yeah, so the primary drivers of wetland loss have varied through time. In the mid-1900s, and even prior to that time, wetlands within the U.S. were mainly drained and filled to support agriculture. By the late 1900s, so we're talking 1986 through 1997, urban and rural development was associated with over half of net wetland loss, followed by agriculture and upland forested plantations. During our most recent study period, which covered 2009 through 2019, loss was associated approximately equally with upland forested plantations, agriculture, and development. Other drivers also likely contributed to net wetland loss during the recent study period, including climate change and sea level rise. Although we don't specifically track drivers like climate change and sea level rise, we can infer their effects by looking at how land cover has changed. For example, we've detected highly significant, long-standing change from salt marsh to open water at the coast, along with a small gain of saltwater wetlands within areas that were formerly uplands and freshwater wetlands. And these changes align with what we would expect from sea level rise. In part because the current causes of net wetland loss are so complex, we'll definitely need a wide variety of approaches to fully address this loss. In other words, there really won't be one solution to our wetland loss challenge. We're going to have to dig deep and get creative.
So the mix of what's been encouraging wetland loss has changed, and it seems to be constantly changing more or less when you take a look at these 10-year periods in these reports. What about the rate at which we're losing wetlands annually? How has that rate changed? Has it been more or less constant? Has it slowly gone down over the decades? Or is it accelerated? What did you see there?
Yeah, so that also has changed through time. So in the mid-1900s, we were definitely losing more wetlands on a net basis than we are today. However, even though we've made a lot of progress in terms of wetland conservation, we are noting that with the exception of one status and trend study period, we've seen a net loss through all of our studies. And over the last decade, we've actually seen an increase of, we've seen the rate of wetland loss increase by 50%. So we definitely haven't got to no net loss. Things are better than they were in the mid-1900s, but we still have some hard work to do. So
if I heard you correctly, the rate at which we're losing wetlands has jumped over the last during this period. I mean, I have to keep remembering, this report, looks at what was happening up to 2019, and of course it's 5 years after that. But what you're saying is the rate of wetland loss jumped by about 50% over the period prior to that?
Yes, exactly. So our prior study period looked at 2004 through 2009. And this study period, which covered 2009 through 2019, saw rates jump 50%. Wetland loss rates jump 50%.
So any thoughts about what what might be behind that? Because that, to me, that's kind of surprising. I thought that the rate was slowly going down, in part because we've lost a lot of wetlands, right? I mean, so there's fewer of them, and maybe the ones that are remaining are a little more difficult to develop into something else. But that kind of surprised me, frankly.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly what we're going to find. We try not to predetermine. We try to just look at the data and call it as it is. But that is indeed what we found.
And so is there trends within causes like more agricultural development of wetlands or more urban development of wetlands that seem to pick up during that period? And anything like that?
One thing that I noticed was that it doesn't all necessarily come down to loss, right? Because when you look at net numbers, you're balancing loss and gain. So what I saw between the last study period and this study period is there was actually less gain.
Okay.
So the loss, held relatively steady, right? But we saw less gain.
Okay. And so gain, I guess, has to do with maybe areas that were once wetlands being restored or something like that.
That's one driver of gain.
Okay.
Gain can be driven by all sorts of things. So it can be driven by, direct restoration, or it can be driven by climate and climate changes, for example. So
okay.
There was quite a lot of gain in the prairie pothole region over the last few decades.
So this report comes out about every 10 years. Do you have any way to I mean, it sounds like you were a little surprised by these results. Do you have any indication in the interim, what might be happening, or you don't really know until you sit down and you go through all of the analysis inherent in producing the status and trends report?
We certainly have our guesses, but it's a national report. And so, what I see around me isn't necessarily, what's going to, drive our findings. And so, again, we all have our guesses. We could look to a specific hurricane, or we could look to sea level rise, or we could look to policy changes, or a whole host of things. But being a scientist, I really try to reserve judgment until I see the data, and I let the data speak for itself.
Understood. So what are the primary tools that you and your co-authors rely upon to determine the status and trends of wetlands in your report?
Yeah, so the data for our report were collected by assessing land cover in 5,048 4-mile square plots that were distributed randomly across the lower 48 states. And then we use satellite imagery as well as airborne imagery, field visits, and on-screen digitizing to examine each plot for land cover changes, specifically changes involving wetlands between 2009 and 2019. We use these techniques to monitor changes to 13 wetland and 4 deep water, as well as 5 upland classes. And I want to note that we define wetlands using a biological definition, which is not the same as the U.S. regulatory definition. That biological definition is a broader definition. So once we've collected the data from our 5,048 plots, we use statistical analysis to measure wetland and deep water gain, loss, and type conversion. And we ensure data quality through a multi-step process. It involves quality control by a series of regional and national experts, as well as field verification and an automated series of logic checks. So it's really quite the process. It's very well documented, and all that information's online.
Well, it sounds like, you painstakingly examine your results and have other people review it. And it's not something that is done lightly. I'm sure everybody knows how important it is, and that's one of the things that drives the effort to make sure that whatever you produce is defensible, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, we look at our results and then we look at them again. Multiple people look at them, but yeah, we do take it very seriously. Another thing which helps us in terms of accurately getting at trends is that we use the same plots pretty much every time we go and we collect these data. And so we've had decades to look at land cover within these plots. We visit the vast majority of the plots in person. And so, we've been refining these data for quite a while.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like you're employing the scientific method to its full extent there, and you're doing sampling and not only using the satellite data, but you're ground truthing it.
Absolutely.
So, are there any other trends that stood out to you in this latest report?
Definitely. So the report found that wetlands now cover less than 6% of the lower 48 states, which, as I mentioned before, is less than half their area in the 1780s. Additionally, as I mentioned, wetland loss rates have increased by about 50% since 2009. And I want to emphasize that these losses have disproportionately affected vegetated wetlands, like marshes and swamps, resulting in the net loss of 670,000 acres of these vegetated wetlands, which amounts to more than the land area of Rhode Island. So, yes, we're losing wetlands overall, but we're particularly losing these vegetated wetlands. Forested wetlands were the most affected wetland type by area, and salt marsh was the most affected in terms of percent area lost. In contrast, pond area increased by over 7% between 2009 and 2019. And this includes stormwater retention ponds, stock ponds, and other kinds of ponds that are commonly created by people. People like to create ponds. That's definitely one of my take homes from this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're not only losing wetlands overall, but we're transforming remaining wetlands from vegetated wetlands like marshes and swamps to open water systems like ponds and mudflats. And this is important because the loss of vegetated wetlands, even if replaced by non-vegetated wetlands like a stormwater retention pond, the loss of vegetated wetlands alters wetland function and leads to the reduction of wetland benefits. This is because vegetation itself does a number of things for us. It builds resilience to storms and sea level rise by reducing wave energy and erosion and supporting accretion, enhances water quality by trapping sediment, oxygenating the water column, and removing pollutants, regulates climate by trapping carbon dioxide and storing carbon, and provides vital habitat for imperiled and commercially valuable species. So the report really makes it clear that not only have we not met the goal of no net loss of wetlands, but we're really headed in the wrong direction.
So I remember when President Bush made that goal in the 80s of no net loss of wetlands. And I thought, wow, that's great. And boy, I can't, wait to see us achieve it, but we're still chasing it. So, kind of to summarize what you just said there, we might add more ponds, but the ecologically beneficial wetlands, the most ecologically beneficial, salt marshes and swamps are declining. And, I spent a lot of time, on water issues in Texas and the West. And, wetlands are really important for water quality, among other things. And so, the water quality in the rivers are, worse and worse. That's more expensive to treat it. and it's just more of an expense to people in general that they're probably not too aware of. Did you say? Now I want to make sure I had this right. Did you say that the annual loss was somewhere around 670,000 acres annually, or overall over the last 10 years?
Overall,
okay,
for the last decade or so, or between 2009 and 2019, we lost 670,000 acres of vegetated wetlands.
So about 67,000 is the rate, more or less, during that period annually.
More or less.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, I started my career focused on wetlands, and actually some wetlands have been in the news here down in the area where, the Rio Grande meets the Gulf of Mexico. And so I'm curious, how is Texas done in this last iteration? Is it kind of seeing the same trend that you see across the rest of the 48 lower states?
Yeah, so, our report does have a national focus. Thus, even though we collect data in Texas and this information is incorporated into our national findings, we don't provide specific estimates of what's going on in Texas or any other state. That said, when I looked at the maps that we produced as part of our report, that they do show that wetlands within Texas changed similarly to wetlands nationally. So in Texas, just like we saw nationally, we saw a decrease in vegetated wetlands and a gain of non-vegetated wetlands, especially ponds. Vegetated wetland losses in Texas were primarily found near the coast and towards the eastern part of the state, I believe, partly because there are more wetlands in the eastern part of the state because it's wetter.
Well, I'm going to make a shameless plug here for anyone listening to this podcast that the Texas Water Journal recently published, or at the end of last year, article called "The State of Texas Wetlands," and I would encourage anybody who's interested in learning more about what's going on in Texas to go back and read that article, or listen to the podcast with the lead author of that article, Rachel Fern. So the trends in your report impact communities in Texas and across the U.S. And what kind of impacts do you see?
Yeah, I'm happy to cover that. But first, I also want to give a shameless plug for your podcast with Rachel. It was really excellent. So thank you.
You can give a shameless plug like that anytime you want.
Yeah.
She did a great job, by the way. Yeah.
She did. Absolutely. Okay, so back to the impact of wetland trends, especially loss, particularly the loss of vegetated wetlands on our communities and on our wildlife. To put it most plainly, I would say that wetland loss and alteration decreases human safety, health, and economic prosperity. For example, wetland loss increases susceptibility to natural disasters like floods, storm surges, droughts, and even wildfires. It impinges on human health by decreasing supplies of food and clean water, as well as opportunities for recreation, hunting, fishing, etc. And it lessens economic prosperity by reducing tourism and leading to the destruction of infrastructure like roads and buildings. It should be noted that the human environmental impacts stem not only from the loss of wetlands, but their replacement with other land covers. For example, replacement of wetlands with development and agriculture not only reduces the pollutant removal benefits that wetlands provide, but increases pollutant inputs in the form of fertilizer, waste, sediment, and toxins. Additionally, replacement of wetlands with development often places people and infrastructure in locations that are more vulnerable to natural disasters, such as storm surge along the coast and flooding near streams. Right? But of course, wetlands are also important to fish, wildlife, and plants. And the loss and alteration of wetlands leads to the decline of fish, wildlife, and plant populations, including rare, commercially important, and culturally valuable species. To better understand just how important wetlands are to wildlife, we really need only consider that wetlands occupy less than 6% of the lower 48 states, but about 50% of threatened and endangered species are wetland dependent. Wetlands also provide shelter and vital nursery habitat for many commercially important fish and shellfish species, and declines in fisheries have been directly associated with decreases in wetland area. Our report looks at wetland gains, losses, and type conversions, but even when wetlands aren't lost, the benefits that they provide can be affected through disturbance and associated declines in condition. So, for example, wetlands near urban, suburban, and even rural development are often affected by pollutants, changes in water regime, alteration of hydrologic connectivity, and the introduction of invasive species, which compete with the native species. And so our reports, they don't document wetland condition. They really just get at wetland loss, gain, and type conversion. And for this reason, they provide a conservative estimate of the effects of human, climate, and other change drivers on wetlands and their benefits. And even this conservative estimate of the effects of wetland alteration are really mind-boggling to me.
Right. Well, you may not be familiar with this, but Texas now has a flood planning process. We've had a water supply planning process for decades, but we have just started planning for future floods and how to reduce flooding impact. And the first of those plans is going to come out sometime this year. And then it'll be updated every 5 years. And so I'm hoping that one of the features of that is, hey, let's think about preserving, restoring some wetlands in areas that make a difference to flooding downstream. And that, there will be a recognition of that because, it's often the kind of, gray infrastructure response we get for issues like flooding and water quality. But, wetlands are a great green infrastructure response that provide, multiple benefits that, again, are, hard for people to see. And I think that's one of the reasons why they don't recognize those benefits.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just want to mention that I work for the National Wetlands Inventory Program, which is part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and part of what NWI does. A big part of what we do is we produce wetland maps, which we offer online through your phone to really anyone who wants to access them. And those maps support planning for wetland restoration, conservation, modeling related to flooding. These maps help to figure out, exactly where wetlands should be restored in order to mitigate, flooding and other natural disasters. So we do more than just produce these wetlands status and trends reports. We also, produce this geospatial data that just drives a whole host of modeling and decision making.
So I remember when those maps first came out, I was an intern for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Fort Worth, Texas, and I had a little device where I was trying to calculate the area of those types of wetlands, palustrine, forested wetlands, etc., in the Trinity River floodplain between, that goes through Fort Worth and Dallas. And so I think that's right after those came out. And that was like a really cool new tool that was available to everyone. And I'm sure, they're much more accurate than they were 100 years ago when I used them, but they're really significant. I'm sure that, there are a lot of people who spend, much of their day looking at those maps, depending on what kind of activity they're involved with.
Yeah, absolutely. They're used for so many different things. For instance, not just planning where you're going to restore a wetland, but deciding where to put energy infrastructure, such that it, least affects wetlands. So knowing where wetlands are really is critical for best managing wetlands and conserving their benefits into the future.
So does your report contain any recommendations for how to better support wetland conservation?
Yes, the report contains a series of strategies, which of course everyone can read about, within the reports. I don't want to bore them with the details, but the gist of what we recommend is that in order to achieve no net loss of all wetlands, including vegetated wetlands, we really need a strategic update of America's approach to wetland conservation. Taking action, enhancing wetland conservation is especially important today because most wetlands in the conterminous U.S. have already been lost. Wetland loss has recently accelerated, and future declines will likely be magnified by the effects of climate and land cover change. The revised approach that we are advocating for really needs to be developed in coordination with government and non-governmental partners based on lessons from the past and robust science, including the types of maps that are produced by the National Wetlands Inventory Program. A collaborative approach that includes tribal, state, local, and private partners is going to be essential. Again, there is no easy button. There is no one fix. And meeting our conservation goals and the needs of our communities will necessitate a long-term commitment to doing the hard work that's needed to better conserve wetlands and improving our approaches through time. So this really gets at the adaptive management process. In addition to that, we emphasize that scientific information like this report is foundational to the strategic implementation of all natural resource policies and will be critical to the success of this effort, the success of enhancing our wetland conservation strategies. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service looks forward to producing our wetland status and trends reports into the future so that these reports can continue to support evidence-based conservation approaches. And that is one thing that the service does to support wetland conservation. The service does so much. We have a whole host of wetland protection and conservation programs, grant programs, for example. And the service just tries to work through all these efforts to better conserve wetlands because, again, wetlands are essential not only to, safe and economically strong communities, but to our fish and wildlife and plants.
So have you started working on the next report yet?
So I haven't started working on the next national report because I can't, right? Because we don't have the data, the time hasn't passed, and we do need to be patient and wait. But we have started to work on the coastal watersheds report, which is one of our regional reports. And then after the coastal watersheds report, we'll produce the prey pothole report. So, in between the national reports, we produce the regional reports. We're constantly working to assess wetlands and how they're changing and to share that information with the American public.
So you discussed the many factors that lead to wetland loss and gain nationally. Any factors that might be influencing the findings in your next report stand out?
Yeah, so to me, the fundamental answer to your question is that our actions now and for the next several years will determine the results of our next study. So in looking at how wetland trends have changed since the mid-1950s, to me, it's obvious that we largely control the fate of our wetlands and all the benefits that they provide. And we do that through a wide range of programs, authorities, and policies, as well as the daily decisions that we make as individuals. For example, billions of dollars have been dedicated to wetland protection and restoration through voluntary easement and grant programs. And these programs benefit not only the environment and communities, but also landowners by providing no or low cost options for managing their lands, how the landowners want to manage their lands. So it really is a win-win. In addition to these programs, there are, of course, policies at all levels of the government, from federal to state to local, which affect how we interact with wetlands and thus what we're going to see in our report findings. And then, of course, as individuals, we're making decisions every day that affect wetlands. And again, cumulatively, all this will be documented within our next status and trends report. One thing that we can all do to support wetland conservation is really to learn more about wetlands and all the great things that they do to support our communities, and to share that information with your friends and families. So, I guess in summary, again, our actions over the next several years will dictate what we see in our next report.
So, Megan, that really kind of leads to the final question I have for you. How can our audience find out more about your work, more about wetlands, and where can they get a copy of Status and Trends of Wetlands in the Coterminous United States 2009 to 2019?
Yes, so our report is available on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wetlands Inventory website. It's pretty easy to search for. There aren't a lot of, Fish and Wildlife Service NWIs out there, so folks can just go ahead and search. And once you navigate to our website, you'll not only find the report, but you'll find various outreach materials, including a news release, fact sheet, Q&As, and an interactive story map. And I love the story map because it allows anyone to visually explore not just the findings of the report, but examples of what wetland loss and gain look like on the landscape. It includes short video clips as well as interactive images that allow you to explore wetland change. If folks want to learn more about wetlands near them, then they can visit our Wetlands Mapper, which is, of course, also on the NWI website. And the mapper allows users to either use an address or just scroll to go to wherever they want within the U.S. and look at the wetlands that are there. They can click on individual wetland polygons. Those are individual wetland boundaries, and then see a pop-up box with more information about the type and size of the wetland that they selected, as well as how that wetland was mapped. And folks can also find links to state, regional, and national reports within that pop-up box. So it's really, one place that folks can go to get a lot of information, learn more about our report, and learn more about wetlands, even wetlands, nearby.
Great. Hopefully some of our listeners will definitely take advantage of that and to download this report and read it. Now, Megan, I just want to thank you for joining us today on Talk Plus Water. It's really been a great discussion, and I've learned a lot. And I'm sure anybody who is going to be, tuning in to this episode will learn a lot too. And I hope that they will start thinking a little bit more about wetlands where they live and what they can do to get active in protection of wetlands.
Todd, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and be with you and talk about wetlands. Again, a subject that I very much love. It was really a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, as I said, I enjoyed it. And I was going to say, well, we're going to have you back soon, but your report's not going to be another one for 10 years. So we'll have to think of something else to talk about. I'm sure that there are many other topics related to wetlands maybe like your regional reports, that maybe we can find one of those to discuss. So we'll work on that.
Sounds good.
This has been Talk Plus Water, and my guest today was Dr. Megan Lang, lead author of the new report, Status and Trends of Wetlands in the Coterminous United States, 2009 to 2019. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. And I also want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talk Plus Water ready to go. My name is Todd Bottler. Let's talk water again soon.